11 days after I buried my husband, his mother hooked one red fingernail through the ring of freezer keys clipped to my apron and said, "Leave those on the counter before dinner service." Then she looked at my daughter coloring at the end of the prep table and added, "Take the child with you. The business stays with the family." My name is Ava Mercer. I'm 33 years old, and until last summer I lived over a restaurant on the edge of Henderson, Kentucky, in a building that always smelled faintly like coffee, fryer oil, lemons, and yeast, no matter how hard you scrubbed the walls. My husband, Ben, owned Mercer's Table, which sounds fancier than it was. It was a restaurant, yes, but really it was 3 businesses wearing one apron. Breakfast and lunch in the front room, catering out of the back kitchen, pies and rolls for church suppers, funeral meals, retirement parties, high school banquets, and the kind of weddings where the bride cries because the macaroni came out right. Ben's mother, Linda Mercer, liked to tell people her son built the place from nothing. That wasn't true. He built it from a failing meat and 3 she bought cheap after a divorce and then immediately turned into a shrine to herself. By the time I met him, he'd already stripped the nicotine yellow wallpaper, fixed the plumbing, and started making enough money to keep the lights on. By the time he died, the only part of that business actually running smoothly was the part nobody ever gave me credit for. I didn't marry into the glamorous side of anything. I met Ben when I was 25 and working mornings at a hotel breakfast buffet across town, hair tucked under a visor, refilling chafing trays of scrambled eggs that always looked wet no matter how long they sat. He came in 3 Tuesdays in a row with a clipboard and a headache because he was helping his line cook's sister plan a rushed wedding reception, and every venue in town wanted country club prices for folding chairs and baked chicken. He asked me if I knew anyone who could coordinate food for 120 people with 6 days' notice. I said yes, me, if he didn't mind paying cash and letting me boss him around. That should have been my first clue I was going to spend the rest of my adult life solving his emergencies while people called it helping out. We got married 2 years later. We had our daughter, Willa, after 3 years of trying and 1 miscarriage I still can't talk about without hearing the hum of the ultrasound room in my ears. Ben cried when she was born. Linda said, right there in the hospital, "Well, at least maybe the next one will be a boy who can carry the name." She said it while I was still numb from the waist down. I used to tell myself Linda was just old school. That was the lie I lived inside for almost 9 years. Old school, direct, proud. The sort of woman who believed a daughter-in-law had to earn her place. It sounded almost honorable when I said it that way. It kept me from admitting what was actually true, which was that she liked me best when I was useful and quiet. I did payroll when the office girl quit. I booked the catering calendar. I handled brides having meltdowns over table linens. I remembered which church ladies needed the rolls brushed with butter, and which ones would complain if they were. I knew which freezer door stuck in humid weather, which fryer basket was bent, which bartender would no-show if his ex was working the same event, and which supplier needed 3 reminder calls before he'd own up to being late. Linda called all of that women's support work, like I was decorating the edges of Ben's real life instead of carrying half of it on my back. In public, she introduced me as Ben's wife. She helps sometimes. Sometimes. I heard that so often I almost stopped flinching. Ben died on a Friday in May, on Highway 41, 8 minutes from home. It had rained all afternoon. He was coming back from a corporate lunch drop with 2 empty Cambros in the van and a receipt book on the passenger seat. The sheriff said a pickup hydroplaned, crossed the line, and hit the front quarter panel hard enough to spin the van into the ditch. People say things after sudden death that are supposed to sound kind. He didn't suffer. He was doing what he loved. At least he wasn't alone long. None of those sentences help when the person's boots are still by the back door and their coffee mug is still in the sink with half a ring of cream dried around the inside. For the first week, I moved through the restaurant like somebody underwater. I signed invoices I didn't read. I hugged people whose names I forgot while they were still talking to me. I found a tub of pickled onions in the walk-in and cried so hard I had to sit on an overturned milk crate because Ben was the only person in that kitchen who ever remembered to label them in his ugly block handwriting. Willa asked me twice a day when Daddy was done being dead. That was how she said it. Done being dead. Like it might be a shift. The funeral meal was held in our own banquet room because, of course it was. In small towns, if your family owns a place with round tables and steam pans, grief gets catered by your own business. I wore a black dress with a cardigan because the air conditioning in that room always ran too cold, and I tied on an apron over it anyway because the green beans needed finishing and the ham had to be sliced. People from 3 counties came through. Pastors, insurance agents, Ben's regulars, men who had borrowed money from him and women who had never tipped less than 20% in their lives. Linda stood by the framed photo board near the entry, dry-eyed and lacquered into a navy suit, receiving condolences like she was at a ribbon cutting. More than once I heard her say, "Ben worked himself to death for this family." And every time she said family, her eyes slid right past me and landed somewhere near the pie table. What finally snapped something awake in me wasn't even the key comment. It was what came right before. Willa was sitting on a flower bucket in the prep area with a paper placemat and a box of broken crayons someone had found in the hostess stand. She drew our family as circles with stick arms, me in blue, herself in purple, Ben in green because that had been his favorite color since childhood, according to Linda, who liked to act like she owned his memories, too. Linda walked over, looked down at the drawing, and said, "Don't make a mess back here, sweetheart. This is a workplace." Not cruel on its face. That was her talent. The cruelty was always dressed in sensible shoes. Willa slid off the bucket and came over to me with that drawing in her hand and asked if she could put Daddy on the office door. Linda answered before I could. "No, baby. That office belongs to Grandma now." I turned around so fast I sloshed gravy on my wrist. I still remember the heat of it. Linda was already looking past me, already moving on, like she'd simply announced the weather. Behind her, my husband's cousin Troy stopped in the doorway with a tray of rolls in his hands and this strange, tight look on his face, like he knew he'd just heard something he wasn't supposed to hear out loud. I said, "What did you just say?" And Linda didn't lower her voice. She reached for the freezer keys on my apron, gave that little tug, and said the line about taking my child and leaving the business with the family. She said it in my kitchen, in my work clothes, with my daughter close enough to hear every word. And the worst part is, I didn't scream. I didn't throw her out. I stood there with hot gravy drying on my skin and my little girl pressed against my hip, and I did what I had been trained to do in that family every time Linda crossed a line. I swallowed it, because service was starting, and there were people waiting to be fed. That night, after the last aluminum pan was wrapped and stacked, and the sympathy flowers were starting to smell sweet in the wrong way, I found the freezer key ring sitting on the counter exactly where she'd told me to leave it. And underneath it was a yellow legal pad page in Linda's handwriting with 3 words at the top. Transition plan, effective immediately. I didn't read Linda's transition plan right there at the counter. I folded it once, put it in my apron pocket, and spent the next 40 minutes scraping pans because if I had opened it while I was still standing in Ben's kitchen, I might have done something stupid and permanent with a cast iron skillet. Willa was asleep upstairs by then, face sticky from peach cobbler she hadn't really eaten. The restaurant was finally quiet in that strange after-hours way commercial kitchens get, when the refrigerators sound louder than people ever do, and every metal surface seems to be holding on to the day. I sat on the bottom stair outside the office, pulled the page out, and read it under the dim wall sconce Ben had installed himself because Linda kept refusing to hire an electrician for something that simple. There were 8 bullet points. Linda had typed nothing. She wrote everything by hand in the same sharp-leaning script she used for Christmas cards and complaints to management. Effective immediately, all vendor communication to go through Linda. Effective immediately, all catering deposits to be held pending review. Effective immediately, staff schedules subject to Mercer family approval. Effective immediately, office access restricted. Effective immediately, Ava to assist temporarily in back of house until longer-term arrangements could be made. That one made me laugh, and it came out ugly. Assist temporarily. I had built the catering calendar for 6 years. I knew which brides wanted rosemary on the focaccia and which ones would call crying because an aunt had suddenly gone gluten-free. I knew the church funeral committee at First Baptist always undercounted by 10 because they were too polite to admit half the family was still driving in. I knew all of that in my bones, but on Linda's yellow pad I was assist temporarily, like I was the teenage dishwasher who might leave for college in August. The last bullet point was underlined twice. Family assets will remain under family control. That was Linda's whole religion in one sentence. It would have been cleaner if she'd just written what she meant, which was, you were allowed here because Ben wanted you here. The next morning, she started acting like the paper had turned into law overnight. She got to the restaurant before I did, which almost never happened because Linda believed mornings were for people with weak boundaries and weak coffee. When I came down the back stairs at 6:30, still tying my hair up, the office door was shut and the lock had been changed. My key slid in halfway and stopped. Linda was inside on the phone, laughing the fake business laugh she used when she wanted somebody to think she understood numbers. There was a banker from First River seated across from her, and Ben's cousin Neil, who had sold insurance for 20 years and therefore believed himself qualified to speak on any topic involving money, death, taxes, refrigeration units, or women. I stood there holding a crate of eggs while Neil looked right at me through the office glass and then looked away, the way people do when they know something is wrong, but are already rehearsing how they'll tell themselves it wasn't their place. 5 minutes later, Linda opened the door just wide enough to block the entrance with her body and said, "Would you mind starting prep? We're in the middle of family decisions." Family decisions. I had slept over the restaurant for nearly a decade. My daughter's first steps were on the black rubber mats by the dish pit. I'd held Ben's hand in the walk-in when we found out the second fertility treatment had failed, because it was the only place nobody would hear me cry. But at 6:31 on a Saturday morning, with my husband dead for 12 days, I got told to go chop onions while the family made decisions. I wish I could tell you I told her to go to hell. I didn't. I carried the eggs to the prep table and started separating yolks because brunch was coming whether I had dignity or not. That's the thing about restaurant work. It doesn't care about your personal collapse. Hollandaise breaks if you stop whisking. By 8 o'clock, the first contradiction showed up, then 3 more. The flower supplier called asking if I still wanted the table garlands for the Dawson wedding tasting on Wednesday. Linda had told everyone catering was on hold, but nobody had actually canceled anything. Then a mother of the bride named Kelsey called in tears because she'd heard from a cousin that Ben had died and wanted to know if her daughter's June reception was still happening. Then Father Rourke from St. Agnes stopped by the back door in his windbreaker to confirm the luncheon count for a memorial the next day and asked me, not Linda, whether we could do the lemon chicken with extra green beans because the widow hated potatoes. He didn't even glance toward the office. He just handed me the folded parish list the way he had for years and said, "I knew you'd know where to fit us in." Linda came out halfway through that conversation and tried to take the paper from my hand. Father Rourke blinked at her and said, very mildly, "I'll leave this with Ava. She keeps the details straight." I still remember Linda's smile after he walked away. Tight, dry, like a person chewing aluminum foil. By noon, she had demoted me without using the word. She told the servers to bring manager-level issues to her. She moved my clipboard off the expo counter and set it by the register like it belonged to a hostess. She asked me, in front of 3 line cooks and a delivery driver, if I could stick to kitchen support for now. Kitchen support. As if my hands had not signed half the contracts on her board. As if the wedding binders color-coded in my handwriting had appeared there by weather. Marisol, our pastry lead, looked up from glazing a sheet cake and then back down so fast it almost hurt to watch. Marisol had worked with me long enough to know when not to make eye contact, because if she did, I might start crying, and then neither of us would recover. Later, she came to the dry storage room while I was counting canned tomatoes and said, under her breath, "You know this place stops breathing without you, right?" I shrugged like it didn't matter. That was another lie. It mattered. It mattered so much I could hardly stand up straight. The real crack came that afternoon with the Barton wedding. Not the event itself, just the tasting. 12 people, little paper place cards, 2 chicken options, 1 beef, and Linda floating around the dining room acting like she had been born carrying a silver coffee pot. The Bartons were one of those families who spoke softly, but expected the room to bend around them anyway. Their daughter, Emmy, had emailed me 27 times in 3 weeks, all about candle height and sauces and whether the plated salad would look skimpy in photos. Linda sailed up to the table with a smile and said, "I'll be taking over coordination now." Emmy looked confused. Then she looked at me, standing by the kitchen door with my tasting notes in my hand. "But Ava knows the allergy list," she said. Linda laughed and said, "She helps in the back. I'm handling the business side." Emmy's father set his fork down. "Then who am I supposed to call when something goes wrong?" he asked. Linda opened her mouth, but before she answered, Emmy said, "Because with respect, every time we needed an answer, she answered, not you." There it was. Small, public enough to sting. Private enough that the room didn't stop. Linda recovered fast, of course. She said all communication would be streamlined. She used the word streamlined like a threat. The tasting limped along. I stayed out of it. I did exactly what I was told. I helped in the back. That evening, after close, I went upstairs to put Willa to bed. She was already in her pajamas, 1 sock on, 1 sock off, sitting cross-legged on our bed with Ben's old order pad in her lap, because she liked pretending to write grown-up lists. She held up a page and said, "Mommy, I made a restaurant." On the paper she had drawn 3 boxes. 1 was the stove, 1 was the table, 1 was a door with a little stick figure standing outside it. Me, apparently. She pointed at that one and said very matter-of-factly, "This is where Grandma says you go now." I tucked her in, waited until her breathing settled, then went downstairs to the office door and tried my key again, even though I already knew it wouldn't work. It still jammed halfway. I stood there in the dark hall, palm flat against the wood, and for the first time since Ben died, I stopped thinking only about grief and started thinking about something else. What, exactly, had Ben put in place before he left me in a room full of people who thought I only belonged near the sink. The first person who said Ben's name to me like he was still a real person and not a source of paperwork was Darnell Coates, our produce guy. He came through the back door Monday morning with 2 crates of romaine on his shoulder and a clipboard under his arm, saw Linda at the desk pretending to reconcile invoices, and asked me, "You still want the Thursday produce split for the school board lunch, or did they move it?" He asked me because for 6 years he had never once asked Linda anything that mattered. She paid bills late and argued over bruised tomatoes. I was the one who knew whether we needed 60 lunch salads or 84, and whether half of them had to be dressing on the side because the superintendent's wife had a thing about soggy greens. Linda cut in before I answered and told him all catering was under review. Darnell just stood there, 1 crate still balanced against his chest, and said, "Then somebody better review fast, because that lunch order's under Ava's code." Linda frowned like he'd suddenly switched languages. "What code?" she asked. Darnell looked at me, not her. "Catering code. Separate billing, separate route sheet, same as always." Then he lowered the crate, signed his ticket with a squeak of his pen, and left me with the first clean little crack in Linda's picture of the world. That afternoon, I got a call from Shelby Hearn at the county health office. Shelby had been our inspector for 3 years, practical woman, low voice, never wore makeup, knew exactly which restaurants cleaned before inspections and which ones actually kept things clean all the time. She said she'd stopped by to do the seasonal review on the off-site catering kitchen file, and Linda had told her there was no separate file. Shelby sounded puzzled in the careful way public employees do when they're trying not to say, "Is she stupid or lying?" She asked if I could come by the county office the next day with updated commissary paperwork, because some of the records were still in Ben's name and some weren't. I almost told her I couldn't because Linda had effectively pushed me into the sink again, but Shelby said, "Ava, I need the person who actually knows the workflow." That sentence did something to my chest. It hurt, but in a useful way, like somebody pressing on a bruise and proving it's real. So the next morning, while Linda was in the dining room lecturing a 16-year-old hostess about posture, I drove over to the county office with Willa's extra sweater still lying in the back seat and 3 years of inspection binders on the passenger side. That was where I learned what Ben had done, or at least the first part of it. Not from some dramatic confession, not from a hidden safe. From a woman in county-issued flats opening a file drawer and sliding a manila folder across a laminate desk. "Here," Shelby said, flipping through pages with her finger. "Mercer's Table main restaurant permit, Ben Mercer. Off-site food service endorsement, Ava Mercer, managing operator. Mobile hot holding exemption, Ava Mercer. Temporary event servicing file, primary contact, Ava Mercer." I stared at the forms because I remembered signing them, but I had never stopped to think about what it meant. Ben always handled the big picture stuff, or at least that is what I told myself. The truth was more embarrassing. I handled anything that required consistency, memory, and showing up on time. He handled the parts people could point at and praise. Shelby kept talking. "If the restaurant changes control, that permit can transfer with inspection. The off-site program can't unless the managing operator signs off." "That's you." I asked her to say it again because I honestly thought I'd heard wrong. She did, slower this time. Linda could stand in the dining room under Ben's framed reviews and call herself owner all day long if she wanted. But the catering arm, the one that supplied the funeral meals, school lunches, church banquets, wedding tastings, retirement dinners, and half the cash flow that kept the front room afloat, could not legally run one more tray beyond the building without my signature and my current food safety credentials. I sat in my car for a long time after that with the air conditioner running and my hands on the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. Mostly I felt stupid in a new direction. Because this wasn't some last-minute grand gesture from Ben. It was years of practical choices I had participated in without fully naming them. I had taken the certification classes because somebody had to. I had sat through county workshops on transport temperatures and allergen procedures because Ben said I was better with details. I had built the off-site binders because if I didn't, nobody would. Bit by bit, the part of the business that actually required trust had settled around me like muscle memory. Ben had known it. Linda had refused to. When I got back to the restaurant, Marisol was elbow-deep in pie dough, and Linda was on the phone in the office telling somebody that once we simplify the staff structure, everything would be under control. I went straight to the dry storage room, closed the door behind me, and opened the catering calendar on my phone. 23 events in the next 9 weeks. 3 weddings, 4 church luncheons, a school board contract, 2 memorial receptions, 1 chamber banquet, all of them booked through the off-site program. All of them dependent on me in ways Linda clearly didn't understand. The second part of the reframe came from Denise Waller, who had done our books 2 afternoons a week for years and was the closest thing that restaurant had to a historian. She was 62, wore orthopedic sandals year-round, and could tell you exactly how much fryer oil cost in August of 2019 if you gave her 30 seconds and a legal pad. Linda had frozen her out after Ben died because Denise encouraged dependency, which in Linda language meant Denise answered questions with facts instead of flattery. Denise called me that night from her screened porch and asked very quietly, "Has Linda seen the split deposits yet?" I said I didn't know what she meant. Denise exhaled through her nose the way she did when a stupid person was wasting her time. "Front of house goes into the restaurant operating account," she said. "Catering deposits have been landing in a separate merchant account since last fall." Ben set it up after his mother tried to pull cash flow reports on a holiday weekend. He told me, and I quote, "If she ever tries to grab the sign in the building, let her. The working parts are Ava." I sat so still I could hear the refrigerator hum from my own kitchen upstairs. Denise kept going. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't some secret trust fund. It was just a separate payment system, separate event expense tracking, and a habit Ben had gotten into of routing the business that depended most on relationships through the person who actually held those relationships together. The event profits weren't gigantic. Denise was clear about that. But they were clean, current, and not tangled up in the restaurant's equipment debt, back rent on 1 freezer repair, and the line of credit Linda kept pretending didn't exist because pretending was her native language. That should have made me feel protected. Instead, it made me furious, for a reason I hadn't expected. Ben had seen the shape of the danger. Not the car crash, obviously, not death, but her. He had seen her clearly enough to build around her, and still he had left me inside the room with her without ever saying the words out loud. Maybe he thought there would be time. Maybe he thought keeping the peace counted as kindness. Maybe he thought I already knew my own value because I was standing in it every day. I didn't. Not fully. That was the cost of being the person everyone relies on while calling you support. You start believing your own invisibility is just professionalism. I didn't tell Linda what I knew. I didn't need to. She overreached all by herself 2 days later when she called a full staff meeting before breakfast, stood under the chalkboard menu Ben used to rewrite every morning, and announced that all future catering clients would now deal directly with her because she was restoring proper family oversight. Then she turned to me in front of everyone and said, "Ava, I'll still need you for kitchen execution, obviously." Kitchen execution. Like I was a pair of hands and not the bridge between the promises and the plates. Nobody said anything for about 3 seconds. Then Marisol put down her whisk. Darnell, who was dropping off onions and had no reason to stay, stayed. Even 16-year-old Emily from the front counter looked sick. And from the back prep sink, old Reuben, who had worked at Mercer's table longer than Linda had been divorced, muttered, just loud enough for half the room to hear, "Then she better learn the names of the brides." Linda heard him. She went cold around the eyes, and I knew, standing there with the coffee still burning my empty stomach and Willa's crayon drawing folded in my purse, that the next thing Linda tried to take wasn't going to be quiet. Linda's overreach arrived wearing pearls and carrying a 3-ring binder. It was Thursday, just before lunch, and the dining room smelled like coffee and bacon grease and the lemon cleaner Emily had used too heavily on the front windows. I was slicing tomatoes at the prep table when Linda came in from the office with that binder tucked against her side like she was walking into a board meeting instead of a restaurant where the ice machine coughed every 30 minutes. She set it down in front of me, flipped it open, and said, "Good news. I booked the Henderson Chambers summer banquet." I wiped my hands and looked down. 210 guests. Past appetizers, buffet dinner, dessert service, coffee station, staff in black button-downs, set up at the Riverfront Event Hall. Date, 3 Saturdays away. Deposit received. Final menu pending. At the bottom, where the event compliance section should have been, Linda had written, "Ava to handle permit side. Not asked, not discussed. Assigned. Like refilling tea." I said, "You booked off-site service?" She smiled that dry little smile of hers. "That is what catering means, yes." "I know what catering means. I'm asking if you booked an off-site event before figuring out whether you could legally execute it." Her smile disappeared. "There is no need to use that tone with me in my son's business." There it was again. My husband dead 11 days, then 12, then 14. And somehow the room kept rearranging itself so I was the one misbehaving if I spoke like an adult. I turned the page. Linda had underpriced the job by so much my stomach dropped. She'd quoted 2019 labor rates, forgotten rentals for chafing racks, forgotten delivery fuel, forgotten insurance riders, and somehow included hand-passed crab cakes for 200 people, as if crab had entered a charity program while I wasn't looking. She had also promised the chamber president that Mercer's table would continue its tradition of seamless event hospitality under family leadership. I almost laughed at that. Almost. "Linda," I said, trying very hard to sound calm, "this number is wrong. Even if the permit issue didn't exist, this price is wrong by at least $4,000. She snapped the binder shut with both hands. "I did not ask you for an opinion. I asked you to do your part." My part. That phrase followed me all day. Through lunch service, through a call from Emmy Barton wanting to swap the beef option for salmon because her future mother-in-law had suddenly become anti-red meat, through Willa falling asleep in a booth upstairs with one shoe still on. My part. Like my whole life was a compartment somebody else got to define. Near close, Linda cornered me in the hallway by the dry storage room and lowered her voice in a way that was supposed to sound intimate and only made my skin crawl. She said, "Sign the county forms, help me get through the banquet, and we can talk about what role makes sense for you long term." I remember staring at a case of canned peaches stacked over her shoulder while she said it. Peaches in heavy syrup. Ben used to joke they were apocalypse food because nothing on earth could destroy them. Linda was offering me a role in the business I had been keeping alive. in the building where my daughter still slept upstairs under the quilt my mother sewed before Willa was born. I said, "What role makes sense for me?" Linda didn't blink. Something more appropriate. Less visible. Less visible. That was her poison belief right there. Not just that I wasn't family. Worse. That family worked best when I disappeared into function. The next morning, I drove to the county office before she got up from whatever expensive moisturizer and coffee ritual passed for grief in her world. Shelby was in her little office with a desk fan aimed at a tower of files. I told her exactly what Linda had booked. I showed her the compliance sheet with my name written in like a default setting. Shelby read it, took off her glasses, and asked one question. "Did you authorize use of your managing operator credential for this event?" "No." She nodded once. "Then here's the plain English version. If they run off-site under your credential without your sign-off and something goes wrong, the county will still start by calling you." I felt heat crawl up my neck. "Can she submit it anyway?" "She can submit paper. Paper isn't magic." Shelby pulled a form from a stack, highlighted 2 lines, and slid it over. "If you want off-site operations separated from the current restaurant management, file this today. It won't close the restaurant. It will just make it clear your certification is not available for events you are not managing." I wish I could say I signed it without hesitation. I didn't. I sat there staring at that line for a long time, hearing every warning voice I grew up with. Don't make things harder than they already are. Don't look vindictive. Don't punish the whole staff because one person is awful. Don't be the woman who blows up a family business right after a funeral. All the training came rushing back. Be useful. Be reasonable. Be tired quietly. Shelby didn't push me. She just said, "Ava, there is a difference between helping and letting somebody use your name like duct tape." That landed harder than any speech would have. So I signed. After that, the day moved with a weird, almost holy clarity. I picked Willa up from preschool. I bought her the dinosaur macaroni she liked because she swore the shapes made it taste cheesier. I came back to the restaurant at 4 for dinner prep and found Linda in the office on speakerphone with the chamber president, all confidence and false silk. She waved me in without muting the call and mouthed, "Tell her." Tell her what? That the event was fine? That we were one big functioning family? I stood in the doorway and listened to Linda promise tasting samples next week and a revised service diagram by Monday. When she hung up, she turned to me and said, "I need your paperwork first thing tomorrow." I said, "You're not getting it." For a second, she genuinely didn't understand the sentence. That was almost the strangest part. It was like speaking to somebody who had never considered the possibility that a lamp might refuse to turn on. Then her face changed. "Excuse me?" "I'm not signing off on the banquet, or any off-site event I'm not managing." Linda stood up so fast her chair hit the filing cabinet. "You ungrateful little, after everything this family has done for you." I cut in before she could finish, because if she said little girl or gold digger or wife, temporary, I might have folded in on myself from sheer rage. "No," I said. "After everything I have done for this family." We stared at each other in Ben's office, my husband's office. Her mouth actually trembled, not from sadness, from outrage that the furniture had spoken back. Then she said, very cold, "You came with the ring, not the name. Don't confuse the two. That one will probably stay with me until I die." She thought she had ended the conversation. She was wrong. I walked out of the office, past the hostess stand, through the kitchen, and into the alley behind the building because I needed air before I either screamed or threw up. Reuben was out there smoking half a cigarette he knew he wasn't supposed to have on shift. He looked at my face, ground the cigarette out under his heel, and said, "She finally say the quiet part?" I nodded. He leaned against the brick wall, hands in his apron pockets. "Then you better stop saving her." I went back inside 5 minutes later and finished dinner service. I plated meatloaf. I refilled mashed potatoes. I smiled at regulars. I tucked Willa into the corner booth with crayons and orange slices. And at 8:17 p.m., while Linda was in the office trying to work out labor costs for an event she had no business booking, my phone started vibrating over and over. First the chamber president, then Emmy Barton, then Father Rourke. Somehow, in less than an hour, the right people had realized something at Mercer's table was no longer being held together by the person they trusted. I answered the chamber president first, because she had the kind of voice that made you sit up straighter without knowing why. Marlene Bishop did not waste syllables. She said, "Ava, Linda tells me you're stepping back from event coordination. Is that accurate?" I stood by the hand sink with my phone tucked against my ear and watched Marisol pipe whipped potatoes into hotel pans like she was icing a cake she wanted to strangle. I said, "It's accurate that I'm no longer managing off-site events for Mercer's table." There was a pause, not shocked, measuring. Then Marlene asked the real question. "Can they still execute what they sold me?" I could have lied. I could have bought Linda another week of borrowed confidence. I had done that kind of thing for years, just in smaller doses, smoothed the panic, covered the gap, turned somebody else's arrogance into my emergency. Instead, I said, "You need to ask Linda what permits and staffing she has in place. I don't want to mislead you." Marlene thanked me in the tone people use when a door has quietly closed and they've understood the shape of the room on the other side. By 9 that night, 5 more clients had called. Emmy Barton, crying and apologizing for crying. Father Rourke, somehow both gentle and blunt at the same time. The school board secretary, who always sounded like she was reading from a note card even when she wasn't. A woman from the hospital foundation luncheon. Then Dana Kessler from the Riverfront Event Hall, who got right to the point. "I need the updated insurance rider and the off-site servicing documentation by Monday or your date releases." Not my date, obviously, but that was how everybody in that town spoke to me about catering. It had been my calendar, my diagrams, my bad handwriting in the margin, my phone buzzing at midnight because a groom's mother suddenly remembered 12 of her cousins didn't eat pork. Dana asked if she should still be dealing with me. I looked through the office window where Linda was talking with her hands at Neil, like motion alone could make numbers behave, and said, "No, not for this account." Dana went quiet for a second and then said softer, "All right, I'm sorry." That sorry got under my skin more than any of Linda's insults had, because Dana understood exactly what was happening, and she understood it without me having to perform the injury. Monday morning, the county notice came by email and certified mail at the same time. Clean, simple, bureaucratic. My managing operator credential was no longer attached to Mercer's table off-site service, effective immediately, unless and until I personally resumed that role. No drama, no fireworks, just reality put in the right file. Linda called me into the office before I'd even tied on my apron. She had the email printed out and flattened on Ben's desk with both hands, like if she pressed hard enough the words would change. "Fix this," she said. I read the page, set it down, and said, "There's nothing to fix." Her face changed the way milk changes right before it turns. "Do not play games with me, Ava. You know what this does to the business." I almost said, "No, what it does is show you what the business actually was." Instead, I said, It stops you from using my certification after I told you not to. Linda leaned back in Ben's chair and gave me a look I had seen on her face exactly twice before. Once when a hostess quit in the middle of Derby weekend, and once when Ben told her we weren't naming Willa after her. It was the look she wore when she realized force might not work, and she had to try shame. "After everything Ben's family gave you," she said, "this is how you repay him?" That hurt, because she knew exactly where to aim. Grief makes you stupid in tender spots. For half a second I wanted to cave, just so I would not have to hear my husband's name used like a debt collector. Then I heard Shelby's voice in my head. The difference between helping and being used like duct tape. I said, "I'm not repaying Ben by lying for you." Linda stood up so fast the chair wheels rattled. "You are not taking this place from me." "I'm not taking anything," I said. "I'm just not holding it together for you anymore." The tasting for the chamber banquet was set for that afternoon because Linda, in one of her more reckless bursts of confidence, had insisted she could lock the menu by Monday and reassure everyone face to face. By 2:00, the banquet room was set with white paper over the tables because the linen order had not been confirmed. The sample plates were wrong because Linda had forgotten Marlene's vice president was allergic to shellfish and had also somehow failed to order enough salmon to test both versions side by side. Emily, the hostess, was folding napkins with trembling hands. Reuben had been told to leave the floor and stay invisible after correcting Linda in front of Neil about portion counts. Marisol was still there, but only technically. She had her car keys clipped to her waistband and the expression of a woman whose patience had already left 10 minutes ago. Marlene arrived with 2 board members and Dana from the event hall. Dana carried a slim folder. That was the first sign Linda was in trouble, because practical women only bring folders when they expect someone else to be messy. Linda floated toward them with coffee cups and false warmth. She launched into a speech about continuity and family stewardship and Ben's legacy. Then Dana asked for the updated insurance rider. Linda said it was in process. Dana asked for the off-site operating file. Linda said county paperwork had been delayed. Marlene set her coffee down and said, "So are you catering my event, or are you planning to explain it beautifully while somebody else cleans up after you?" I was standing by the kitchen door holding a tray of sample plates when all 3 women turned and looked at me. Not because I had stepped in. Because Linda had made the mistake of saying, "Ava handles execution." There it was again. My role, chopped down into labor right in front of the people who knew better. Marlene asked me directly, "Are you managing this event?" And for the first time in that building, in front of witnesses Linda cared about, I did not soften the truth to protect her feelings. "No," I said. "I'm not." The room did not explode. It didn't need to. You could feel the floor shift anyway. Dana closed her folder. Marlene looked at Linda for a long second, then at the plates in my hands, then back at Linda. "Then we're done here," she said. "I am not handing a 200-person banquet to a story." Linda started talking fast. Misunderstanding, temporary paperwork, family grief, disloyal staff. Dana cut in and said the date would be released by close of business. One of the board members pushed his untouched crab cake away like it had become embarrassing to look at. Marisol took off her apron, folded it once, and set it on the sideboard. Reuben walked out to the alley without asking permission. Emily started crying quietly behind the coffee urns. Linda turned on me then, right there in the banquet room, in front of the chamber board and the event hall manager and the remaining staff. "You did this," she said. "You would rather burn Ben's name than let his family lead." I put the tray down because my hands had started shaking. "No," I said. You just finally did it without me there to hide it. That evening, after the chamber banquet disappeared, 3 wedding clients called within 2 hours, and just before closing, Marisol knocked once on the dry storage door where I was standing alone and said, "Wherever you go next, don't wait too long to call me." I called Marisol the next morning at 7:12, before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring like she'd been awake for hours, which she probably had. Bakers are either saints or people with unresolved issues around control, and Marisol was honest enough to admit she was a little of both. I said, "I don't have a full plan yet." She said, "Good. Full plans are usually fake. What do you have?" What I had was a county file with my name on it, a phone full of clients who no longer trusted Mercer's Table, a husband-shaped hole in my life, $840 in my personal checking account, and one thing that mattered more than all of that put together. For the first time since Ben died, I understood that saving Linda was not the same thing as saving what Ben and I had actually built. The first month was ugly in the plain, practical way real life is ugly. Not dramatic ugly, expensive ice sculpture falling over ugly. No, it was folding table ugly, borrowed chafers ugly, calling 6 people to find 2 server aprons that matched ugly. Father Rourke let me use the fellowship hall kitchen at St. Agnes on weekends because he said the room had hosted enough casseroles to survive one more reinvention. Shelby helped me file the transfer paperwork for a small off-site operation under a new name. I didn't call it Mercer anything. I couldn't. That name had become too crowded. I called it Bluebird Suppers because Willa had seen one on the power line outside our apartment the week after we moved and acted like it was a personal message from the universe. Marisol came with me. Then Reuben, after Linda told him kitchen hands are replaceable, and he laughed so hard he had to sit down before quitting. Darnell extended me 30-day terms on produce even though I had no business asking. Dana at the event hall sent over a copy of their preferred vendor requirements with a note clipped to the top that said, "When you're ready, call me." It wasn't rescue. Nobody handed me a miracle. But the right people stopped pretending they couldn't see who I was. Linda tried to keep Mercer's Table going without me, then without Marisol, then without Reuben, which was like trying to keep a truck running after removing the engine, the tires, and whatever part makes the brakes worth trusting. She hired a consultant from Evansville who wore expensive loafers and talked about brand refresh in a town where most people just wanted hot coffee and their eggs cooked the same way every Friday. She brought Neil in to help with oversight, which mostly meant standing near the register with his thumbs in his belt loops, looking managerial while customers waited too long for biscuits. The front room stayed open a while because restaurants can survive on habit longer than they deserve to. People came in out of routine, out of sympathy, out of curiosity. But the catering side never recovered. Once trust breaks in food service, it doesn't break loudly. It leaks. One church luncheon goes elsewhere, then a school contract, then a wedding planner quietly removes your number from her spreadsheet. By September, Linda had a dining room and a sign and the kind of pride that still mistakes possession for control. By November, she had cut weekday lunches, then Mondays entirely. By Christmas, Mercer's Table was only open Thursday through Sunday, and every person in Henderson knew what that meant, even if nobody said it directly. The only time Linda came to see me in those months was at St. Agnes, of all places. We were setting up for a memorial meal, chicken, green beans, yeast rolls, banana pudding, the kind of menu grief can survive. Willa was at a little table in the corner drawing horses with impossible eyelashes. Linda walked into the fellowship hall wearing a camel coat that cost more than my first car, and looked around the room like she'd stepped into a version of life she found insulting. She said, "You really are doing church basement catering now." I was laying out serving spoons. I didn't even look up right away. Old habits. Then I caught myself and did look up, because that was part of the change too. I said, "No, I'm doing booked solid catering now." It wasn't a movie line. It wasn't even especially clever. But it was true, and truth has a steadier pulse than performance. Linda opened her mouth, closed it again, then glanced toward Willa and softened her face in that fake grandmother way she used when there were witnesses nearby. Willa looked up from her drawing and said, clear as a bell, "Mommy works here. Don't touch the trays." Marisol nearly walked into a wall trying not to laugh. After that, Linda stopped calling. Not because we made peace, because there wasn't one left for her to control. I heard from Denise that Mercer's table finally sold in early spring. Not for what Linda thought it was worth, and not to anyone who cared about the Mercer name. The buyers gutted the dining room, painted over the tobacco brown trim Ben had always sworn he'd replace next winter, and turned the place into some polished farm-to-table thing with pendant lights and tiny portions. I drove by once with Willa in the back seat. She asked if that was where Daddy used to cook. I said yes. Then she asked if we had to go inside. I said, "No, baby, we really don't." And I meant more than the building. Grief didn't leave because business got better. I want to say that plainly. There were nights I still reached for Ben in my sleep and woke up angry at the shape of the bed. There were mornings I heard a joke in my head and turned to tell him before remembering there was nowhere to turn. Starting over didn't heal that. But it did something else. It stopped me from living inside the version of my life where my value only counted when somebody stronger was claiming it. That false role Linda had built for me, helpful, background, temporary, less visible, didn't end in one big confrontation. It ended in invoices with my name on them, in clients asking for me directly, in Willa no longer hearing anybody tell her her mother belonged behind a door. It ended in little things, better things. Me locking up a kitchen that was actually mine to close. Me buying a second-hand van in my own name. Me teaching Willa how to snap green beans on a folding chair while Marisol pretended not to spoil her with extra icing. A few weeks ago, after a Saturday wedding drop, I came home tired in the good way, the earned way, and found Willa asleep on our couch with one sneaker still on and a crayon tucked into her fist. I carried her to bed, came back into the kitchen, and hung my key ring by the door. Not the old freezer keys from Mercer's table. A new ring. Van key, hall key, storage key, my own office key, if you can call a converted closet with a printer and a coffee maker an office. I stood there for a second with my hand still on the hook and realized that was the whole thing, really. Linda had wanted the name, the building, the visible part. I got the working life. I got my daughter. I got to stop asking permission to be seen. If this story stayed with you, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, shared it with someone who would understand it, and subscribed to the channel for more stories like this. And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. At what point would you have stopped covering for Linda? Do you think Ben should have told Ava everything directly before it got that far? And have you ever been trapped in a role that only ended when you finally stopped making other people comfortable?